All right, thank you. Well, welcome everyone to our webinar on enhancing retail intelligence, integrating AI with your existing camera systems. I'm Jeremy Hodge, Director of Marketing and Insight, and I'm going to be your moderator today. So I want to briefly introduce the topic we're going to be talking about. Today, we're going to be tackling one of the biggest challenges in retail IT, how to integrate AI without a costly overhaul. AI-powered video analytics can optimize store operations, improve efficiency, reduce shrink, but many IT layers struggle with integration, cost, and security concerns. So we've got two great experts here who are going to help us navigate this. And just a little bit of housekeeping before we dive in. This session is meant to be interactive, so drop your questions in the chat throughout, and we'll cover as many as possible in the live Q&A at the end. And if you need to step away, don't worry, we've got you covered. We're going to send out the recording after the session. So I want to introduce our speakers today. We've got Mark Kilgore, Managing Director of Insight, leading our retail practice, and Carissa Price, the Chief Customer Officer of Dragonfruit AI. And Chris is going to be talking about all the great work they're doing with us in this space. So, and thank you both for being here. Really appreciate it.
Yep.
So, Mark, I want to start with you. Talk to me a little bit about, kind of why retailers are struggling to succeed with AI. What are the challenges that they're facing today?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I think, specific to this space, when we talk about computer vision, as we're engaged with our retail clients, well, the retail clients primarily, there's a few things. And I think starting off, it just has to do with the number of computer vision companies that are in the market. So, if I step back for a minute in kind of what preceded our partnership with Dragonfruit, clients were asking us, what we were seeing out in the market. And so we stepped back and, did a proper exercise to do some diligence, on what is in the market. And for Insight, with our heritage as a value-added reseller, we have pretty standard and good processes for that. So, I think one of the challenges is trying to look at the landscape in its entirety and then determine how to down select. So, I think that's kind of number one. And in fact, Carissa and I were just at ISC West conference last week. And when you look at that exhibit hall, it's hundreds and hundreds of computer vision and video intelligence firms there. So, I think when we looked at that and we started to distill that down, one of the things that really led us to Dragonfruit was the platform that they have and really the enabling technology from an AI perspective. That was number one. The second thing, particularly that resonated with me, was the use cases. Not so much in that what they are, but in what informed them. And that was through like frontline deployments in a retail environment where they're learning, they're going back and they're making updates and enhancements to use case, and their product, the roadmap itself is informed by that experience. So that was probably the second thing that, really registered with me. And then the third thing was more just, I think, alignment from a cultural perspective. I think, Dragonfruit was very aligned with Insight in terms of a couple of main things. One is just being pragmatic in terms of our approach to serve clients. And then the second, might be overused, but, they are very client-centric. And that felt very good for us from an alignment perspective. So, the first thing, I think it's hard to kind of look at everything all up and try to figure out what might make sense for you or your company in terms of where you're at. So I think that's maybe the first thing clients struggle with when they look at this space. And I think, the second thing is kind of where to begin. And that's about prioritization and focus. And I think prioritization and focus, is a challenge at this point in time because the use cases from an AI perspective, I think generally, and also in this, they're emerging. Some are more nascent than others. Some are more mature. So, I think without, kind of some advice or some steer along those lines, it's going to be difficult to understand where to start. And I think the third thing is just generally integration challenges. So if we think about, this solution as it's deployed, it'll be deployed in a store, and it will start to, kind of consume and generate data within that store, and it's going to then require both technical integration and I would say functional integration. So for technical integration, of course, depending on the range of use cases that have been prioritized, you're going to have to integrate apps, you're going to have to integrate data, et cetera. And then also functional integration, because if you think about the coordination required, depending on, again, the use cases, you very well might have store operations coordinating with merchandising. You're definitely going to need to have IT involved because as you're generating data at the edge, potentially, that's going to represent something that, well, I would say exposure from a security perspective that would need to be addressed and mitigated. So I just think there's a lot of integration that's required. And that is not only, technical, but also kind of cross-functional, which is not, in an in-store environment isn't always, required, particularly you talk about like loss prevention or asset protection, but is becoming more important now to ensure that, all the teams are aligned and stack hands, so to speak. And then the fourth thing I think is costs. And Jeremy, when you teed me up on why retailers struggle to succeed with AI, I do see a lot of successes in the market in terms of like productivity, like internally focused, productivity gains. So, I wouldn't want to categorize all of AI, in that regard. But when I think about AI as it's deployed, maybe across the value chain, if you will, and in this instance, like a store footprint, there's a lot of hesitation because there's some assumptions and there's some reality in that, what that might cost if you had to add all the compute and all the storage, the licenses and everything like that. So I think that can kind of be concerning, from a how do we get started perspective, particularly in a retail environment, and particularly in a retail environment that, some have much lower margins than others. So I think costs kind of really play into it as well. So that's kind of what I hear, Jeremy, as I'm engaged with clients about, some of the hesitation, I guess, or pause to kind of really dive into this.
That's great. And when you're working with clients, which use cases are you seeing the highest rate of success on right now?
Yeah, okay. Probably about, the first one is going to be shrink. That comes up in pretty much every meeting, and underneath that, it's really about shoplifting detection, and then also self-checkout loss management. So shrink's a big one that is pretty consistently brought up. Another one is spatial insights. So what's happening when our customers are coming to our store? What is their what's their pattern? What are their dwell times? And that really helps arm our merchants and our store operation folks with insights as to store layout and product placement. And then I think the third is around, spill detection. We hear about that quite a bit too, is, can the cameras recognize when something has been spilled, say in a convenience store, right? And can we notify the associate that that's happened, to do two things. One is make sure we got a great store and it's a good customer experience, but two, make sure, we mitigate the risk of a slip and fall because that could lead to a lawsuit. So I think, those three are probably the most consistent, Jeremy, in terms of what I hear.
That's excellent. So I want to transition here because, as we said up top, you don't need to overhaul everything, right? So Carissa is going to take us through how can AI be integrated into the technology you already have. So Carissa, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. And, Mark, building on a little bit of what you shared here, I'd like to debunk the myth that AI deployment is expensive. And I think there's a couple of different reasons that your customers, your clients can think that, because in the past, it has been really expensive. And there are vendors who went to market with AI and cameras, which meant that you had to rip and replace all of your existing camera infrastructure in order to put in these AI cameras. And so that became then a sort of data point out there for people looking at this, but the market has changed a lot. And there's a lot more, as Mark said, and we saw last week at ISC West, an amazing amount of new suppliers in the marketplace that are bringing AI solutions that are really dropping that price of implementing AI. At Dragon Fruit, we were built on the premise that you didn't need new cameras, that you can just add AI through our system. We're a software as a service provider. So not only do you not need new cameras, but in a lot of solutions, point solutions, they've built their models on expensive hardware, right? So, and everyone knows who watches CNBC in the mornings, right? Up until recently, NVIDIA was on a skyrocket ride in terms of their stock price. NVIDIA chips are in high demand. It's hard to get them. So if you're building on servers that require NVIDIA chips, that's also driving up your price as a supplier. Dragonfruit took a different approach. We actually use the Apple Mac Mini, which for the compute power that it offers and the price point is a really good deal for our partners. But as a SaaS provider, that hardware is actually included in our software license fees, which allows us to be able to offer, the lowest total cost of ownership in the marketplace. So it's really understanding how your solutions are architected from the ground up to be able to deliver the solution you're looking for. And I think that's the great thing about our partnership with Insight is you guys are really there working with the customer to find the best solution at the best price point to meet their needs. So it definitely doesn't have to be expensive, and it can be tailored to the use cases, which is the part you were asking about, Jeremy, as well, right? What are the use cases that are going to supply the highest ROI? Well, ROI is calculated, right? It's return on investment. So the higher your investment, then the higher the return has to be in order to justify that. So that total cost of ownership definitely matters, if you will, when you're evaluating solutions. And I think part of the use cases that Mark talked about are super important. Shrink for a retailer is an extremely important number, and the various aspects that contribute to that number are those use cases that you can attack using your existing CCTV camera infrastructure, right? So whether it's shoplifting, or it's liquid spill or slip, trip, and fall, or it's checkout loss management, there's been a lot of coverage, I think, by the media of the challenges that retailers have faced. I mean, labor is their highest expense. So they move to these self-checkout machines to try to reduce the labor cost. But in doing so, right, they upset the equilibrium of now I have a new avenue for fraud and theft that I didn't have before. And so how do you manage that? Also, even on the manned lanes, we have a checkout loss management solution for manned lanes as well to be able to detect, is somebody giving a sweetheart deal? Is a cashier actually committing fraud where they're processing refunds and there's no customer present? Like with video and video AI, you have an opportunity to have eyes on these problems and solve them in ways that the technology just wasn't there even 5 years ago to be able to supplement your loss prevention and asset protection problems.
That's great. So obviously, one of the big strategies in AI is sort of start small, right, and scale from there. So what are some of those smaller AI projects you've seen organizations benefit from? And then I think also, how do you measure the success of that? How do you prove the ROI from those smaller projects so that you can get more investment and further scale?
Yeah, I mean, Jeremy, it's a really good question. So I'll share a use case and a real live case study of a partner that we have, which is Smart and Final, which is a regional grocer in the West. And they knew that they don't have a lot of self-checkout machines, actually. They're mostly staffed lanes. And they knew that their shrink number was going up. And so they were looking for a solution that could solve this for them given their operation type, right? And so they had begun to experiment with some self-checkout machines, but that was secondary for them when they looked at, okay, where's the biggest problem? We need to get a hold of this. And so they were looking for a couple of different dimensions. One, something that could provide a real-time alert so they could stop the loss before it happened, if possible. And then two, something that gave them the analytics to be able to understand what their cashiers were doing in batches, if you will, to know, is it a training issue? Are they missing scans for things, not because it's fraud, actually, but because there's a training opportunity here? And then, of course, to look at the bottom of the basket, which goes to that training opportunity of, they obviously have a standard operating procedure, but knowing in real time, is there an issue that's causing this loss? Because they knew what their loss number was. So back to your comment about starting small and then growing, it was an easy opportunity for them to bring in dragon fruit to show that we could catch these various scenarios with their existing camera infrastructure and the AI, and then help drop that loss number because they knew how much they were losing. They were just looking for a tool that could actually help them manage that. So we proved that out in a short POC, and now we're rolling out the dragon fruit solution across 235 stores for them. In addition, part of the selling point for them was they had other problems too, but they started with the one that was the clearest path to a positive ROI so that internally they could make that use case to the CEO and CFO to say an investment in dragon fruit isn't just an investment in stopping this one problem. We can use that same platform to manage liquid spills, to be able to have a better sense of how our customers are moving through the store. Where are they not just traffic counting, but also where are they shopping? Where are they engaging? Are the new displays or perhaps product launches working like we think? That same platform, once in the store, is allowing them to then have future applications that meet their business needs as they change over time. But they're doing it on a foundation of a very provable positive ROI for them.
Yeah. Hey,
That's great.
Chris, yeah, Jeremy, I was going to add there that's probably the thing from a client perspective that is, again, resonates with me, is that foundational kind of approach to where, you can start, with Dragon Fruit. The beauty of the platform is there are 19 apps, and every client is in a different space, so one of the 19, I'm sure, is going to address, something in that environment. But the fact, when you go in with the thought process of it being more foundational, then you have an eye toward layering on, incrementally over time, additional kind of apps to enable more use cases. So, it becomes this kind of this cycle of value, if you will, because as you get through the first few, you're going to learn, and then, so on and so forth. So, ideally, you have a foundation that is leveraging, all 19 apps that's relevant for the company, really to drive that sustainable kind of value over time.
Yeah,
No,
I
that's
think your
great.
point, Mark, too, and I would add on, Jeremy, is for retail, as I said before, labor is typically their biggest cost center. And so depending what the retailer's problems or issues are, typically it has something to do with labor, right? So I shared about loss management, but we have another retailer right now that we're just kicking off a POC, and the CEO there himself was the one who, when he asked questions, when the loss prevention people brought the Dragon Fruit platform and they started to tell him about it, he said, well, hey, I have specialized labor force that's in different areas of my store. Am I staffing appropriately? Like, is the traffic matching the labor I have in these different departments? And can I actually deploy them more efficiently? Can Dragon Fruit help me solve that? And the answer was yes, because not only can we identify the employees and the staff, we can give them the real-time data on how customers are coming in and moving through the store, which allows them to optimize in real time in ways that without the Dragon Fruit data, they can't, right? They can see overall traffic counting, but they can't necessarily see how it varies by department and then match their labor to that. And with the Dragon Fruit system, they can now actually move labor in real time to say, okay, I don't need as many people in the shoe department right now. I actually need them over in women's sporting good wear, and move those resources in real time to optimize their outcome.
That's great. I think that, that notion of you start in one place and you're then going to realize the value of all these other areas in your business is really powerful, because sometimes you look at an AI roadmap, think, oh, how am I going to do all this? There's so many things, there's so many challenges, but the fact that you're seeing clients just pick up on that as they use it is fantastic. And it actually brings me, Mark, to something I want to ask you about, which is obviously there's an adoption methodology here, right? You've got to kind of start small and scale. So how should people think about navigating that? What are some best practices?
Yeah, well, I'll bring back in prioritization, because I think that's important, and the ability to identify, high impact use cases. And, it can be as straightforward as the traditional kind of 2x2, where you think about use cases in the sense of, business value on an axis, and then ease of implementation, on the x-axis, and then you have your quadrants, right? That's pretty basic. But I also think it's important to think about these use cases in terms of the outcomes around, your customer experience, merchandise experience, associate experience, and just generally store operations, because I think that starts to bring in a little bit more of, also the competitive landscape, but being able to address that if you're thinking about if you suspect, or if you might be a little bit lagging from a customer experience perspective, then even though that one may not have as high a value as maybe another in merchandise experience, it still might be the one to start with, to kind of get ahead of that, so to speak. So, I think the start, is just, it's really the organization and the prioritization of those use cases. And then, as Chris had mentioned, as we talked a few times, definitely strongly advised starting with a proof of concept. I mean, there's no sense in trying to take something to the enterprise when we're just, trying to figure out how to get everything to kind of work together, both from a, functional perspective and again, from a technical perspective. And then finally, you got to, really align to your internal stakeholders. As Chris has said, you start small, then you can take it, to the approvers and say, look at the results, right? Here's where they are. And then also it's important for the internal stakeholders to know once you've had some success to kind of maybe double down on it a bit, because again, all industries are hyper competitive. I happen to have spent a long time in retail, so I would tend to think it's more competitive than others. But that's kind of one of the refrains I know Chris and I kind of hit a lot. It's just like, it's like there's a cost in action here, right? And that's not trying to be anything about, well, you better hurry up and do it or anything, but it just is. I mean, things are moving very quick. And this AI is emerging at the same clip. So, as that competitive environment heats up, retailers are going to continue to look toward AI to improve their competitive positioning, and get more share of wallet, get more foot traffic, get more customers. So I think it's important to call out as well.
I want to go back to, you mentioned aligning with internal stakeholders. What are some strategies you've seen that are effective to get that buy-in? Because obviously it's not just IT, it's the line of business, sort of all aspects of the organization that are getting involved in these AI discussions now.
I can jump on that for a moment, Mark, and then have you add on. I think what we've seen, Jeremy, and it's a part of why we were excited to have this partnership with Insight, is that traditionally in retail, the cameras have been owned by the loss prevention asset protection department. And IT had very little touch points or knowledge of the cameras infrastructure that was being put in, etc. I think with the entrance of AI, obviously IT is more involved now. And I think it is an opportunity for IT leaders and LP, AP people to work together as key stakeholders of building this new world. And it's a real opportunity for both sides, I think, to get to know each other better and bring out the best of what each brings. Part of what we've seen is that as you adopt these new technologies, the network and the network design becomes super important. Bandwidth is, an issue here of how you implement these things. And I think IT has a really important role to play in supporting that camera infrastructure in new and improved ways to make sure that the organization is getting the most out of their camera infrastructure and that support is coming from the IT department in ways that only IT can really optimize for the business. And I think Insight as that partner to IT in terms of design, architect, optimization is a really important partner for us at Dragonfruit, because that's not an area that we're involved with, but we know that those stakeholders are at the table asking the right questions for their business and needing some help of figuring out how do you make the most of your camera infrastructure and how do you future proof it? How do you manage security, privacy, all of these things?
Yeah, Chris, I don't have much to add there other than to the point about Insight, and our ability, to be knowledgeable and conversant with all things from an architecture perspective. I would say with existing clients, for sure, a lot of times we know more than we think we do about their operating environment. Especially with our beginnings, not only as a VAR, but also in data centers and on-prem. So we're very much skilled and capable to help lend our advice to design, and making sure that whatever's done is the most optimal balance between doing it on-prem or in the cloud, because there are cost implications to all this as well. In addition to, Chris, I think you mentioned the latency, right? Some things just may need to run on the edge, some things may not, right? So that also feels good about the partnership, is that the intersection of kind of like Dragonfruit, Insight, and then our client, it seems like the right team to kind of move these initiatives forward.
Excellent. And one other question here. So we talked about measurements, sort of as you're doing pilots, but as you're thinking about really scaling this to your organization, you're getting all this data, you're tuning the models. How do you think about the success of those models and just the bigger outcomes that you're driving?
So I could start here and maybe not screw it up too bad, and then you could clean up my mess if that's okay. But
You bet.
no, just something I've heard and kind of read a little bit about is if you think about shoplifting detection, it's interesting because just because you see someone put something in a bag does not mean it's shoplifting. It could be a bag they were just going to carry it in and exit, right? So it's not until they leave the store without purchasing it as actual shoplifting. So when you think about these models, it's like you have this balance of like false positives, which could be a risk, and then you have also context, right? So the more and more data and that this consumes, you'd likely have a higher index from a context perspective, thus kind of lowering your false positives, right? Because false positives can be problematic in a store environment if you're confronting individuals. That results in a negative customer experience, a negative associate experience, and doesn't feel good. So that was my AI hat little role there, Carissa. Now you clean up that mess now.
No, it was a great answer, Mark. And one of the things that our CEO at Dragon Fruit is famous, if you will, at least internally, for saying is AI is not magic. And so I think it's important for people to understand what it can do and what it can't do. And there's always going to be that partnership between human and AI. So, building on what Mark said, of a shoplifting detection app like ours can help you with your risk scoring. It can help give you a sense of this is probably somewhere to look versus not. But at the end of the day, it's each retailer having to make a decision about how they want to use that data, what do they want to do with that data to balance that customer experience with the shrink and loss, right? And as Mark said, there's many varieties of this problem because there was a woman who commented on LinkedIn on one of our posts about shoplifting, and she is in a wheelchair herself and very active in advocating for people with disabilities and making sure that AI isn't actually creating more problems for people with disabilities. And it was a really good question she asked, exactly the example that Mark gave. If you're in a wheelchair, you're probably taking a product off the shelf and putting it in something in your basket or bag, etc. That's not shoplifting. If you had a model that said, I want an alert every time someone takes an item off of a shelf and puts it somewhere not traditional, aka a cart, etc., you would be pinging all the time for this person in the wheelchair and for people shopping in wheelchair. And no retailer wants that, right?
Yeah.
So it is actually blending those real world examples with what AI can do, and then working with the customer to say, how do you want to use this data? We can give you this, we can tell you that there's a risk here, but what do you want to do with this data? Because as Mark said, the truth of the matter is it's not shoplifting until someone walks out of the store and didn't pay for it. And even then, there can be accidents of, oh, I didn't realize that I didn't pay for it. And so you need to handle these things with care because a customer is not likely to go back to a store where they're being accosted for shoplifting and they didn't do anything wrong, right? So AI can't solve that. It can give you more data, it can give you more information, it can help you. Like, we're working with a large retailer in Europe around shoplifting as an issue, and they've at least done the forethought to say, okay, we really want to focus on the highest value items. That's what's driving that overall number. We can't look at it all over the store. We know what the number is, again, so you can calculate that ROI, but we can't figure out how they're getting it out of the store. So in this case, they're not going to use the data to stop someone in real time. They're really using the data to understand where do we need to change our processes and how we do what we do to focus on the tip of the spear that's driving the actual financial problem and try to fix that, rather than say, I'm going to track every person across the store and try to stop every shoplifting. No, they're actually focusing on the highest potential for an ROI, which gets to, again, the point of they're very realistic about what AI can do today, and then how they want to use that data in their loss prevention efforts.
That's a great point. I love the example about the customer in a wheelchair. Just reinforces the need for responsible AI and how it's, not just risk management, but for your company, but it's about the customer experience overall. So that's a great one. All right, let's transition to taking any questions that you all have. If you drop them in the chat, we will make sure to go look there and answer them. And I will see, I'm going to pull that up here. We also have some ones that were submitted directly. All right, so one is actually around, we've talked a lot about success here, but a question around what does a failed proof of concept look like? How or why would one of these proof of concepts fail? What do you need to watch out for?
Mark, you want me to take that?
Yeah, start. I'm noodling right now. I'm trying to,
Yeah.
it's like the interview question of like, what do you do bad? You're like, oh, think about that. Yeah.
So I'd say there's a couple parts I would say to the answer of that question. One is if you haven't defined the actual KPIs that are going to decide success or not success, then you can have a failed POC just because it ends up being more of kicking the tires on a shiny new object and not like we know what we need to solve. We're looking for it to do X, Y, and Z. If it can do X, Y, and Z, then we're going to move forward. And so I would say part of it is just faulty POC design where you haven't gotten crystal clear about what it is that you're trying to solve. The other one I would say too is, and again, this is something Dragonfruit has learned over time, and which is thus the saying AI is not magic. Sometimes the customer really is clear about what they want to solve, and we on the tech side can say, okay, we think we could do that, or we think we could approach it this way, but we're not 100% sure that it'll solve it, right? And so then you do the POC literally as a proof of concept, not like the first one where it's out of the box product, etc. Because we have quite a few products that are coming out of beta or in beta, and you need the real world to sort of define it can do this, but it can't do that. And I think the example is inventory management. So we can do inventory management using the cameras that people have and our AI, but oftentimes what we found in these POCs is that the cameras that they have don't work well to actually see the shelf. And there's a variety of reasons for that. The angle, someone standing in front of the shelf, and that's where you can't see it, right? Think about it. If a human can't see into the shelf, the camera can't see into the shelf. So in that case, I think it's one of those things of just getting crystal clear of, in today's state of the art of visual AI, it can do this, but it can't do that. And we can try in your environment to make it work, but that would lead to a failed POC where both sides are saying, okay, that was great, we learned this, but we know it can't work with our existing cameras. And so we're not going to try to tackle this problem with that because we don't want to invest in new cameras, right? So it's not that it couldn't work. It's just that in this environment, using the camera infrastructure they already have, it can't solve their problem. And then you have a different path to how you want to move forward of, do you want to invest in new cameras? Do you want to invest in a different way of tackling the problem?
Yeah, Chris, one thing I would probably add to that is also just generally about like just overall execution. So with an AI solution, we're gonna generate more data. We're gonna integrate that data. We're gonna integrate the apps, and there's gonna be workflow, right? But really, it comes down to process adherence. So all of that, if it notifies an associate to do something, right, you have to execute. So that's the old traditional kind of like it used to be like merchandising blaming the store operations on execution because we're not getting the sales. But it really does come down to that because if you think about that backdrop, especially in store with associates, you have a much higher than average turnover from an industry perspective. So, you have, this cycle of turnover, and then you have this process you got to follow. So I think it's incumbent on the retailer to ensure that, it's good store managers, and good training and everything like that, because you can have the best data and the best alerts that are available, but if you're not following through and doing the process, then you're not gonna realize the results.
Yep. Can you talk a little bit about the time required for an internal team to do one of these POCs? What does it look like from level of effort, the time frame to get one of these things off the ground?
Um, it's usually quite minimal because the installation is actually happening by Insight or is quite easy to do. So that part is not difficult. I think the biggest time lift is just the internal setup of getting the information about the cameras. And again, in a case with Insight involved, I think that they can help greatly in that, and not having internal resources have to actually get that information collected. But after it's set up, because all of the configuration is done remotely, and then it begins. And what we typically do in a POC is we have those conversations in our customer kickoff of what are the KPIs, what are we looking for, and then we'll have a weekly call for the period of the POC to go over the results of where are we in the journey of standing it up, where are we in the journey once it is stood up in terms of delivering on the KPIs, are there issues with cameras, with the network, and again, working with someone like Insight, ideally that time would actually be minimized from the customer on some of those dimensions. And then the conclusion of it. Okay, we've been running this for 30 days, 60 days. What are the next steps? And typically, like in the case of Smart and Final, for example, we began that conversation after the first 30 days because it was clear that it was actually working. And now it was, okay, what are the next steps in terms of rolling this out for 235 locations?
Great. There's actually a question in the chat. So looking to understand what product you offer that can integrate AI into our existing systems. So I think, Carissa, that's probably for you on just talking more about Dragonfruit. Mark, anything you would add that we're enriching with from the Insight side?
Sure. So we have 19 different apps. And they go from, I'll just list them off. So using the camera infrastructure that's already there and AI, we can do burglar alarms. So we have a partnership with Gap, who actually replaced their previous burglar alarm system with our Vision AI system. And it gets back to the why was something that Mark said earlier. They had a lot of false positives using motion-based burglar detection. And ours, again, is able to identify, is this a person somewhere where they're not supposed to be, and then sending an alert. So we have burglar alarm, we have smoke and fire detection, we have liquid spill, we have slip, trip, and fall detection. We have spatial insights, which is everything from traffic counting, how many people are walking in and out of your store, to where do they go within the store. We have what we call OSHA compliance suite. So are people wearing the protective gear they're supposed to be, hard hats, vests, shoes, masks, etc. Again, that's where the slip, trip, and fall and liquid spill falls. What am I missing, Mark?
You got me. I can tell you there's 19 of them. I don't know if I can go 1 through 19.
Yes, so we do have, as a video AI company, we do have a VMS, which is a video management system application as the foundation of this. You don't have to use our VMS. You can actually use your current VMS. We integrate with all of the major VMSs out there. But if someone were looking to replace their VMS with us, they could do that. We also have what we call remote monitoring. So some of our customers have grown by acquisition, so they have a variety of camera infrastructures and a variety of VMSs, but they want their GSOC to just have one, what we call pane of glass. So we have a product that actually integrates that all so that the customer can actually have one unifying system across their VMSs, which we call remote monitoring. You'd think I would have this memorized,
Yeah,
but I
yeah,
think I've
no.
listed most of the major ones.
Yeah, Carissa, one
What am I
thing.
saying? Checkout loss management. So we have self-checkout loss management, man lane checkout loss management, POS exceptions. So if you didn't want the full suite of checkout loss management, but you just wanted to know if there was a POS exception issue in real time and have the video to go with it, we have that as a standalone product as well.
Yeah, Chris, I see Jose was keeping us honest. He said, what are you missing? He said, hey, shoplifting, which is fair.
Thanks, Jose.
One thing, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but, in talking to, the team last week, over dinner. I also thought it was really great that there's, for use cases that fall outside of the scope of the 19 apps that Dragonfruit has, there is something that you call Launchpad, correct? That can enable, like, for lack of a better phrase, custom app development.
That's right.
Or again, use cases that don't fit cleanly within one of the 19 apps that the platform has. So I don't know if you could speak a little bit more about that, but that for me, that just provides greater flexibility, to enable more use cases if that's the desire. And also it drives consistency from a platform perspective, because the underlying kind of nuts and bolts are similar to, or the same as, the 19 apps that Dragonfruit offers. It's just, more custom off of Launchpad, I believe, right?
That's right, Mark, and thanks for reminding me. And I do know too, I didn't mention before, their partnership. So we do have weapons detection through a partnership, and we do have facial recognition through a partnership. They're not apps developed by us, but they are integrated into the platform depending on the customer's needs. But as Mark was just saying, in January of this year, we launched platform as a service, essentially, which we call Dragonfruit Launchpad. And it's allowing developers, and Insight is one of those partners as well as others, because we kept seeing use cases that we knew that the technology could do, but they weren't in our direct focus. At some point with 19, you have to focus on those 19. So we couldn't keep developing apps, but we knew that there were a lot of bright people and partners out there who could actually use our platform and develop those custom apps for their customers. So that's what we call Launchpad. And it allows someone to more quickly and easily bring to market that app solution than doing it on their own, because we've solved basically the basic infrastructure needs for setting up a computer vision app and make it quite seamless for our partners to be able to develop on that platform. And they can do it as a custom job where they already have the customer in mind. We have others who had a vision for this and want to take it to market themselves. They can bring it to market through us. It's a very flexible, again, platform as a service that we're offering.
That's great. So many off-the-shelf options that you offer. Just, it seems tons of ways to configure. That point about kind of start in one place and expand, I think really illustrates that with the great list you went through. The kind of follow-up to that, so you talked a lot about kind of the software. On the hardware side, what are the kinds of cameras that companies need to have in place? Is there a certain type they need to work with to make sure that the AI actually connects into it?
So we like to say that we work with any camera, and it is actually true. We can even work with analog cameras as long as there's a decoder on them. And I think the easiest way to think about this is we need a video stream in order for the AI to work, right? It has to have something to analyze. So getting that video stream into the system is really the most important part. And so that's why the type of camera doesn't really matter until you get into the kind of details. There's another one I missed of the 19. So license plate recognition. We have a license plate recognition app. That one, for obvious reasons, you need to be very precise in capturing the numbers. And typically these are in environments where a car is moving. So you can't really work with low resolution cameras to do that. And typically when we stand up a customer around this, there's some back and forth of us looking at the view through the existing camera and saying basically this will work or this won't work, and then making the decision if they want to replace that camera with a higher resolution camera. We also work with 360 degree cameras and deciphering those streams off of a multi view camera into analyzable data points. So we do have experience working with all types of cameras, and typically in that kickoff call and through that first week of setup, we'll do an audit to say, okay, these cameras are working the way we need them to for this particular use case or not, and then work with the customer on what needs to be resolved if there's a reason that it's not working. And I'll give you another example. But think about a camera moving. So a lot of people have put in cameras that actually move. But if you're trying to do spatial insights, for example, and the camera's moving, you're going to miss some of those data points, and it's going to be confusing to the AI because it's looking and then it's seeing nothing and then it's going back. And so there are some issues. It's not that we can't use the data streams off of that or the video streams. It's just that depending on the use case, it can cause some problems for the AI.
Got it. So it all comes down to fidelity, what you're looking to capture, the kind of intelligence you want off that. If it's very granular versus more macro, just seeing people move, that all changes the requirements. Got it.
That's right.
So I think one more question here, and kind of going back to Chris, what you're saying about capturing the data, and I guess any AI conversation comes back to, hey, you have all this data, what do you do with it? How do you think about, as it's all coming in, how do you store it? What are other things you could be thinking about as you're capturing this data for your different use cases? Maybe it's about use case extendability, but just, there's all this intelligence that you have from what we're collecting. So how should companies think about that?
I think that there's a great opportunity. One of the things, obviously, back to the beginning of our conversation today, is what a system like Dragonfruit offers is real-time insights. That's not to lessen the value, per your question, Jeremy, of actually looking at this for long-term insights and seeing, retail is very much a comparison analytics game, right? Of how am I doing today versus yesterday? How am I doing this week versus last week? How am I doing this month versus last month? For seasonality reasons, how am I doing this month, this day versus last year, right? And I think all of this rich data there of understanding how, and again, what I like to say and what got me excited about Dragonfruit when I was first introduced to it as a former retailer working at Walmart is the ability to have what I call e-commerce metrics on brick and mortar stores. So now you can actually see how people are moving through the physical world, and then you can analyze that in all of the same ways that you would use sales data, or in the e-commerce world, right? You would use that data. You can now use the data you're collecting off of your customer journeys in store in very similar ways to analyze, optimize. When you introduce something new, what does that do to the customer metrics? All of those kinds of things with this data and this database allow you to do those kinds of longitudinal analysis of what's actually happening in ways that haven't been possible before.
I love that. E-commerce metrics on brick and mortar. That's a great way to put it. Mark, anything you want to add?
No, I just wouldn't. I mean, I like that analogy, only because, having been in a lot of e-commerce discussions, there's always, it's always about how do we build basket, how do we connect brands with customers and everything like that. And it just, and that's more of a data-driven exercise in that format traditionally, right, or historically. Whereas now, if we're getting more and more intelligent at the store, we're still, I think last time I checked, about 85% of food is still sold in stores, about 15 online. Your ability to make a more dramatic impact, is much higher, which is good for kind of everybody. It's good for the retailer, it's good for the customer, it's good for the suppliers of the retailer, which is a very important relationship, right? Because suppliers are funding a lot of promotions, a lot of advertising. So yeah, it's just, the ability to kind of achieve congruence from a data perspective, both in brick and mortar and online, is I think the returns on in brick and mortar in the near term would outpace that of online, just given the volume that's sold in store.
I think it's a really good point, Mark, and something we hadn't talked about before. The use case for retail media networks, right? CPG suppliers are spending a lot of money with retail media networks, but traditionally they haven't been able to calculate ROAS, return on ad spend, the way they'd like to for the brick and mortar stores because the data didn't exist, right? So you'll see people on the CPG side talk about the retail media tax because on the e-commerce side, they can see those metrics and they're going to increase their advertising proportionately to that ROAS spend. But on the brick and mortar stores, which in grocery, which is the vast majority of CPG, they haven't been able to have those kinds of metrics. And I think Dragonfruit gives them the opportunity to be able to have that kind of visibility, to understand how their advertising is working in the store, to tweak that advertising, and to be able to maximize that opportunity in the brick and mortar store.
Excellent. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so put one last call out there. All right. So let's wrap up here then. I think a few things that I would just have as a takeaway here is, AI doesn't have to be costly, right? It can work with your existing systems to drive real impact. You can start small and scale over time, right? And Chris, all those great examples of what you talked about, I think is excellent in terms of the different apps you can tap into to make that adoption more manageable and effective. So I think a lot of good learnings here. Scan the QR code on the screen if you want to learn more. It's going to take you to our retail AI page. We're also going to be reaching out with the DoorDash gift card as a thank you for attending. If you check your inbox for the webinar recording, you can revisit any of the insights that we shared here today. We'll also have some follow-up content for you as well in that email. I want to thank our speakers, Mark and Carissa. Excellent discussion here. Really appreciate the insights you've shared. And I want to thank all of you for attending. Take care.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Thanks.